be a trial lawyer, and I took a lot of depositions. And whenever I put one of these things on, I remember one of the funniest moments in my own personal deposition history was when I was in a deposition. It was a multi-party case, and there was a large conference table, and there were about 10 lawyers sitting around the table. And in these depositions, when you have multiple counsel, everybody takes their turns asking questions. And one of the we're starting off the day, and the first person to start the questioning was a young man, and this was about 15 years ago. And he, a very nice looking young man, actually, who was given this mic that looked sort of like this, the same principle. And the court reporter handed him the mic, and she said, "Do you know how to put this on?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, yeah, I know how to, I'm very familiar with these. The last time I had to put one of these on was when I was on the dating game and lost." So he was very cheerful about it. But anyway, I can't put on one of these things without thinking about that funny guy. And that was actually the perfect way to start a deposition, obviously, when everybody's there first thing in the morning, whatever. I don't do trial law. I'm not a trial lawyer anymore. I was a commercial litigator for many years. And commercial litigators are lawyers who basically do battle over contracts that weren't very well written. A contract that is well thought through and that is well drafted and that reflects the party's expectations is a contract that will never see the inside of a courtroom. I'll talk a little bit about contracts themselves just as sort of general useful information, but also something to keep in mind when you're kind of thinking through negotiating. I specialize in negotiating business agreements. I know that all of us, though, whether we have responsibility for contracts or not, are negotiating every single day in our lives. We're negotiating for resources for our department. We're negotiating for developing teams or for getting projects and that kind of thing. And obviously, we're negotiating in our personal lives as well to get condos and all those kinds of things. I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly specific, but fairly general, but there will be some specific things. Primarily, my examples are going to be brought from my own experience, so I hope you find them helpful. The title of this sort of sounds like an ordinary title, but there's actually something to this. When I say the fine art of negotiating, I'm going to try to give you examples as we go through about how, in a lot of ways, a person who negotiates an agreement is a lot like an artist. And I'll give you some examples. Scripting and rehearsing, like an actor or a director, are all things that are really integral skills and activities that a lot of people don't think a whole lot about, but which are very, very important in preparing. Sort of the flip side of this also, though, but it's also kind of another variation on the fine art, is that as negotiators, we also have to summon our inner engineer as well. An engineer identifies problems and solves problems. And if you can think of a negotiation as really a problem-solving activity, it becomes a lot less intimidating and it becomes a lot easier to handle. And that's a very, very good organizing principle. Now, a lot of people really don't like negotiating. It's something that they're not comfortable with at all. And the engineer in me is going to has been trying to figure out over the years what is the problem with engineering that makes people hate, with negotiating that makes people not like it so much. And with that in mind, I'm going to try to give you some suggestions, some very specific ways to deal with the things that especially women do not like about negotiating. So that's just kind of an overview here. So let me see if I can get this. There we go. All right. So the second part of the title was negotiating good deals, and I just wanted I already mentioned that you want a deal that is going to hold up, and one that's going to last. A deal that lasts is the best kind of deal to have. And the best way to make it last is to make sure that the expectations of the parties are well understood in advance, and to make sure that obviously that your documents accurately reflect what the expectations are. There's actually one other thing that I'd just like to point out, and this is a lot of times I think what a lot of business people sort of consider what, quote, legal's job is, but it really is everybody's job. And that is when you are considering a deal, think about the risks. my job is to try to figure out what the risks are and to allocate them. That's not strictly a legal job. That's really also a business job as well. So you have to figure out, actually I'll tell you what I tell all of my clients before we start a negotiation, the ones that haven't heard it before, because I obviously do multiple deals for some clients. I tell them all that, actually I'm a very, very optimistic person. I'm naturally very optimistic, but my job is to try to think of all the things that could go wrong and then to anticipate them and to address them now. Because if you haven't addressed them now and something does go wrong, your contract will not protect you. So yes, many of the things, limitations of liability and indemnity, for those of you who are familiar with contract documents, those are the primary obvious risk allocators. However, shifts in the market, changing in the environment that may affect pricing, those kinds of things are all risks that need to be thought about and looked for. And you want to be able to address contingencies or build in the flexibility that you might have in order to address those kinds of contingencies down the road. So very briefly, the topics we're going to be talking about are preparing both before and during. A lot of this stuff is pretty obvious. Managing information is probably one of the most important things to keep in mind. Opening moves, I'll give you some remarks on that. Communicating difficult points, I will give you some specifics on how to address or deal with the difficult points. To speak very briefly about using the spoken word, which is, I think, very, very important for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk to you about that later. Handling hardball negotiators, I only have a few things to say about that, fairly general, but I hope you'll find them helpful. And creating success through leadership, basically some things to remember that will give you more confidence and make you a better negotiator. All of these topics, though, really ultimately deal with information, the management of information, and the communication of them. So, planning and preparing. This is pretty basic stuff, and I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this because I really want to talk about the nuts and bolts later. But these are just basics. Learning and planning for the negotiating style of the other people. Sometimes, actually, I'll tell you something. Since the social networking tools that we now have that we didn't have 20 years ago, LinkedIn, you can figure out who you know, who knows, if you know somebody who knows somebody, just to get information about the people themselves. What is their background? What is their negotiating style? If your company has done a deal with that company before, what can you tell me about so-and-so? Researching the facts, the circumstances, the motivations for each side. Those are things you need to know. Sometimes to some extent, that's private information for the other side, something that they're going to try to control. Your job in terms of managing and getting information is to try to get all the information that you can and then guard your own information to the extent that it's not necessary or helpful in the deal. Making a private list of what you must have, what you'd like to have, what you need to have, what you can't have, what are your deal breakers. But be flexible. Remember that those things can change. And also think that you may learn about things that you can get or things that you can do with the deal that you didn't know when you started. So keep your mind open, and that should be something that's kind of fluid, but it's useful to have all of that. And then identifying the competition. What are your alternatives to the deal? What would happen if you walked away? What would happen if they walked away? Those things are all important. And again, I think this is obviously self-evident. The more thoroughly you prepare, the better you're going to be, the better job you'll do negotiating. So I mentioned before information and managing of information. Information is power. And actually, I wrote a whole article. In fact, I'm going to be rewriting the article probably in the next few days. Wrote a whole article on this for a business lawyer magazine, California Business Law Practitioner magazine, about 10 years ago, on ways that email can ruin deals. And email is actually, you can imagine, the disclosure of information inadvertently to the other side about what's important, what you can have, what you can't have. Time considerations, timing constraints, how important it is for somebody to get a deal done, all of those things. A lot of that private information, if it becomes public, will completely change the character and the nature of the deal. And email, of course, is a really, really terrifying tool in the sense that it's extremely easy, especially when you have multiple people who are on a team. That's just that many more people who can make the mistake of forwarding a thread, not understanding exactly who everybody is on the send list, not realizing that somebody who may have a client.com email address actually is a member of the other side. That happens too. Internal vendors, people who come on and, yeah.
And even deleted email.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, right, exactly. So private information, understanding what it is that you, being careful, making sure that everybody knows what information is not public, if there is information that's very sensitive or that can't be public, or what information can only be disclosed to certain people for a variety of reasons. All of that is, and basically managing the other people on the team to make sure that, actually, bottom line is much, much better to speak with one voice unless specific issues are delegated. Sometimes subject matter experts have to speak on certain points, but speaking with one voice when you're negotiating on a team is extremely important. Be mindful that the questions that you ask, depending on how they're asked, can oftentimes reveal sensitive points on your side. And also the whole question of social interaction. Here's an example. When you are, we were negotiating, I've been negotiating or have negotiated over the years a number of very, very large, important deals for a very familiar client in the Bay Area, where we spend literally 6 months or 9 months actually negotiating a deal, which will typically, during that 9 months, we'll typically have entire weeks where we're in conference rooms from morning until night with the other side working through the various pieces of these extremely large, complex deals. And there is a natural tendency, which of course is which is important and useful, for people to become socially engaged with one another during that process. And you actually want that, especially for a strategic relationship where you actually, really like a marriage, where you're actually going to be your people are going to be working side by side. Your vendor may actually have people coming in and working on your site with your people, for 3 years or whatever. Yes, you have to develop that relationship. So there's a fair amount of, for example, going out to dinner together while you're negotiating. Yeah, we do that. And for a variety of reasons, I think there's some cultural things that were at play in this particular deal, with the fact that my client within the Silicon Valley company was European, and the vendor people were European, and so there was a lot of good dinner and good wine. The supplier sourcing expert from my client, who came in because she was basically, it was her job to roll up her sleeves and push real hard on pricing, came in, and she was horrified that my client was going out to dinner with these people before we had the blue ink on the page. Because she was, it was all business until we had the signature on the page. The bottom line on this is, be aware that when you let your guard down, which is useful for establishing relationships and getting to know people, there are many opportunities for private information to be disclosed, especially when you've had a couple of really good bottles of wine. So anyway, be aware that social settings can present particular challenges.